Hi there, my name is Justin Hibbard, and welcome to Politics in Plain English. Thanks so much for tuning in. At Politics in Plain English, I always begin with a question, and today's question is this: can Congress reject the Electoral College's votes? Now, before I get to that question, if you're new to Politics in Plain English, what I do is take complex political ideas and current events and break them down so they're easy to understand and digest in an explanation that's about 18 minutes or less. I take out the hyper emotion and the spin and try to stick with data and facts, presenting all sides fairly. My goal is that you become an informed voter because I believe that an informed voter is the most powerful voter and the ideal of our democracy. If you haven't done so, would you do me a huge favor and subscribe? You can subscribe to the Politics in Plain English podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I also do a video of these podcasts, which you can find on my YouTube channel. Just search for Justin R. Hibbard, and that's my handle as well on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Justin R. Hibbard, and you can follow me there as well. Lastly, I try and do a podcast episode about once each week, but I do a lot more writing, and if you'd like to get my articles in your inbox, you can subscribe at justinrhibbard.substack.com. Thanks so much for doing that. Now, let's get back to our question at hand. Can Congress reject the Electoral College's votes? At the time of this recording, it's January 7th, 2021. Congress started the process of certifying the Electoral College vote yesterday, but the process was interrupted by an attempted coup by Donald Trump's supporters. Once the National Guard and police officers cleared the Capitol building, Congress reconvened and certified the vote in the wee hours of the morning. A lot of you have reached out to ask, what was it that Republicans were trying to do, and was it even a legal process? That's what we're going to go over in today's episode. Now, normally, we don't even think about this. And in fact, typically what happens on election night is that one candidate is declared the winner and the other candidate concedes the election cordially and peacefully. However, since Donald Trump refused to concede and continued to try and overturn the election, we've now concerned ourselves with a whole number of political processes that we typically have ignored in the past. So let's quickly do an overview of the processes involved in a presidential election. First, there's election day. Citizens go to the polls, or they mail in their ballots, and those ballots get tallied. However, in the United States, remember, we don't elect a president with a popular vote. Instead, we go through a process called the Electoral College, which I describe in detail in episode 2. In the Electoral College system, each state gets a specific number of electors, and generally the winner of the popular vote in that state gets all that state's electoral votes. Now, about a month later, the Electoral College meets at the respective state houses and casts the final ballot for the president. If you haven't done so, you may want to listen to episode 3, where I address the question, can the Electoral College overturn the election? In that episode, I talk about members of the Electoral College who choose not to vote for their party's candidate. And this is called a faithless elector. And there's all sorts of interesting history and various rules about these types of rogue votes. The final process of the election is that Congress meets on January 6th, counts the votes, and officially certifies the election. Now, let's review what happened in the 2020 election. American citizens voted, and Joe Biden became the presumed winner, having obtained 306 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 232. Then in December, the members of the Electoral College cast their ballot, and there were no faithless electors. This means that after the Electoral College met, the total was still 306 to 232 in favor of Joe Biden. And then on January 6, Congress convened to count the electoral votes. Up until then, and that day, President Donald Trump was pressuring Republicans, including Vice President Mike Pence, not to certify the votes. And some Republicans even said that they would indeed try and block the votes from being certified. So here's the question we're after. Can they even do that? Can Congress ignore not just the will of the people, but the actual Electoral College? The answer is yeah, kind of, but it's complicated. I feel like I say it's complicated a lot on this podcast, but let me explain. This goes back to a law from 1887 called the Electoral Account Act. The reason why this law exists is because of the shenanigans that happened in the 1876 presidential election. During that election, there were states that had more than 100% of voter turnout, insinuating obvious voter fraud. When the states submitted the electoral votes to Congress, some states had multiple competing slates of electors, meaning one state sent in two different counts. So some states had claimed that some of their electors were disqualified from voting. It was a real mess. And Congress had to establish a special election commission to sort things out. And ultimately, they decided that Rutherford B. Hayes won the election by an electoral vote count of 185 to 184. So 10 years later, Congress instituted the Electoral Account Act. The purpose was to minimize Congress's involvement in settling Electoral College disputes. The law outlines a process by which the states certify the election results and then send one slate of electoral votes to Congress. Then Congress meets to basically count the votes. But they do have the opportunity to object to specific cases of electoral vote irregularities. The process works like this. On January 6th, the new session of Congress meets together in a joint session. That means that the Senate and the House of Representatives are together in the same room for this particular meeting. The Vice President of the United States presides over that meeting, and then the Vice President opens each state's official electoral record, going in alphabetical order. Now, before the session, the House of Representatives and the Senate each choose two tellers. The Vice President reads the state's record and then hands it over to the tellers for them to verify. The purpose of these tellers is to ensure that the Vice President is reading the state's certified results properly. That was probably relevant in the 1800s, but not so much today, where we have media and get election results instantaneously. So the Vice President reads the first state in alphabetical order, which is Alabama. And so this year, Vice President Mike Pence declared that Alabama and its 9 electoral votes went to Donald Trump. Then he asks for objections. If there are none, then he moves on to the next state, which is Alaska. So what happens if someone wants to object for whatever reason? The person would stand up and state their case. However, there needs to be both a representative and a senator who object. So in the case of the 2020 election counting, there were 6 swing states that Republicans tried to object to: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. However, in 4 of those cases, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin, the Republican representatives stood up, they voiced their objection, but no senator agreed to object with them. So the objection was denied, and they moved on with counting the results. However, in the case of Arizona and Pennsylvania, there were both a representative and a senator who objected. So when this happens, the House and Senate go to their separate chambers, there's debate for up to 2 hours, and then they take a vote. A majority is required in the House, as well as a majority in the Senate, to overturn a state's electoral votes. Congress doesn't debate on all the objected states at the same time. No, in this case, they debated on Arizona. They came back together, went on counting the states: Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, and then they got to Pennsylvania, and they had sufficient opposition to send that state into a debate as well. In both cases, though, the House and Senate overwhelmingly defeated the objection. In other words, they agreed that the electoral votes were fine and they should be counted. So at the end of the night, Vice President Mike Pence announced that Joe Biden had defeated Donald Trump 306 to 232 electoral votes, which was the same tally after election night and the same tally after the Electoral College met. Now, even though you probably had no idea about this process of counting electoral votes, there have been other times since 1887 that the electoral votes were challenged and sent into a debate. However, never since 1887 has Congress actually voted to overturn a single electoral vote. But what happens if they did? Well, I imagine that if that happened, the party that lost those votes would immediately file a court case, and the court would decide if the objection was even justified. Did the objection comply with the Electoral Account Act, or did they object to something outside of the scope of the law? So let's ask 2 questions. First, why would Republicans try and overturn these electoral votes from the 2020 election? The reason that was given was election fraud and voting irregularities. This has been something that the Republican Party, particularly Donald Trump, has peddled, but judges have thrown out over 60 cases for lack of evidence pertaining to these allegations. I think the real reason is because these members of Congress want to pick up support from Donald Trump's base. It's widely believed that Senators Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley are hoping to run for president in 2024. So most likely in order to try and muster up support from Donald Trump's base, they did what they thought was heroic and objected to the votes, even though they knew they didn't have the support to succeed. So in the end, it just prolonged the process by a handful of hours. Here's the second question I want to ask. If a party could, in theory, overturn the Electoral College's votes, why wouldn't they do it to remain in power? Well, if they did that and used a loophole to circumvent the Electoral College and the will of the voters, then we would no longer be a democracy. You see, we are a constitutional democratic republic, and our Constitution and laws aren't written perfectly. There are loopholes. If Congress wanted to overthrow the election, I suppose they could do that, but in doing that, they would be destroying our democracy. We would no longer have a democracy. We would have a party-controlled fascist government. And I think at that point, that would be the end of the United States. The other thing is that these parties know that whatever shenanigans they try, the other party will use those same tactics when they get in power. So as the 2020 election and all of its craziness comes to a close, the lesson to be learned is that there's a number of processes that create checks and balances in our election system. But ultimately, it's up to elected officials to honor the process. Donald Trump advocating for people to blow up that process? That's not democracy. Having a president concede after the votes are counted and having a vice president read the name of his opponent and declare him the winner, those are awesome things. It demonstrates something very rare in this world, and that is the peaceful transition of power.
Thanks for taking the time to tune into Politics in Plain English. If you liked what you heard, could you do me a huge favor and subscribe and maybe even give it a 5-star rating? You can find Politics in Plain English on your favorite podcast provider. The video cast is on my YouTube channel, Justin R. Hibbard. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Hey, it's all the same handle, Justin R. Hibbard. And lastly, I'll try and do a podcast and vodcast once each week, but I do a lot more writing throughout the week. You can subscribe and get my latest article in your inbox at justinrhibbard.substack.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Politics in Plain English.